Good morning. Welcome to the Washington edition of our webinar series exploring state findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat 2040, Choosing an Abundant Future. Here's the agenda for our hour together. And before we get started, let me run through some quick logistics. Everyone has been muted. Don't worry about your barking dogs. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. That little orange arrow at the top allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a questions section of that control panel. Pop that little square, click on that little square, and the questions will pop out, and you can type in a question or a comment, and we will be making time for those about halfway through the webinar. When we're going through the maps on the web app, if the control panel is in the way and you can't see things, again, use that little orange arrow to shrink the control panel. Also note that there is a handouts section of the control panel. If you pop that out, you will find a link to both the full report and to the Washington State Summary that we'll be looking at later in the webinar. We are recording the webinar, and we are going to share the link to the recording with everybody who is registered today. So please feel free to share that with others. So let me now introduce myself and my co-host. I am Chris Coffin. I direct AFT's National Agricultural Land Network, which is an information and peer learning network for professionals and community advocates working to save farm and ranch land. I'm also AFT's Senior Policy Advisor, specializing in farmland protection, land access, and farm viability. Co-hosting with me is Addie Candide. Addie is AFT's Pacific Northwest Regional Director based in Bellingham, Washington. So let's talk quickly about American Farmland Trust. For those who may not be familiar with us, we're a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. Some know us best by our bumper sticker, No Farms, No Food. We take a holistic approach to agriculture. Our national initiatives and regional programs focus not just on protecting the land base, but also on the practices used on the land and on the farmers and ranchers who work the land both now and in the future. As another one of our bumper stickers says, it's not farmland without farmers. Our programs and our research together inform both our state and federal policy development and advocacy. We have 6 regional offices and a national office located in Washington, D.C. And so let me now turn it over to Addie.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. We'd first like to recognize and thank USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service for their partnership and financial support of our Farms Under Threat research. Farms Under Threat is AFT's multi-year initiative to document the status of threats to America's agricultural land base. And NRCS has been an integral partner on this research, as has our research partner, Conservation Science Partners. And for this report, we had a second research partner in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I want to take a minute to acknowledge that we have some really important guests joining us today from the Jamestown Sklallam tribe, the Tulalip tribe, U.S. Senator Patty Murray's office, U.S. Representative Kim Schreier's office, Washington NRCS, Washington Senator Liz Lovelett's office, Washington Senator Marco Lias's office, Representative Jessica Bateman's office, and the State Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Conservation Commission, Housing Finance Commission, and Washington State University, as well as numerous counties, cities, conservation districts, land trusts, and other nonprofits across the state. I'm sorry that I can't acknowledge you all by name. So thanks to each and every one of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here today. And with that, I am going to turn it back to Chris.
Great, thank you, Addie. And we are both going to go off camera so that we can focus here on the slides and then the web app. At least I'm hoping to do that. So let's dive into the methodology and findings from the report. Unlike the last two Farms Under Threat reports, which have looked to the past to document agricultural land conversion, this report predicts future conversion of farm and ranch land out to 2040. How do we do this? We started with our Farms Under Threat State of the State analysis of agricultural land conversion from 2001 to 2016. As a reminder, that analysis mapped conversion of land to two different types, urban and high density development, or what we call UHD, and low density residential development, or what we call LDR. So let's look at what these two types of development patterns are. So urban and highly developed is the traditional culprit in farmland conversion that people have mapped and tracked for many years. Expanding residential areas, industrial areas, commercial areas. It's largely found in and around cities and towns, but it does include some residential industrial sites such as oil, gas, and solar development. Basically anything that can be identified by satellite remote sensing as the built environment. Low density residential development has become a larger culprit, and AFT and our science partners pioneered an approach to map and quantify the impacts of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. We found that LDR areas range from lower density subdivisions to larger scale farmettes and ranchettes. Typically, this kind of scattered large lot housing fragments the agricultural land base and makes production harder for the farms and ranches that remain. While some agriculture can indeed be found on LDR land, and that urban edged agriculture can be quite profitable, we've also found that once land has been converted to LDR, it is far more likely to be further converted to UHD. So starting with our historical data, we projected into the future with the business as usual scenario. Basically, we made a straight line projection using the same annual conversion rate as what we documented historically to predict the level and location of conversion by 2040. We adjusted the model to account for projected population growth or population decline. Building off that business as usual scenario, we developed two alternative scenarios, and we'll get to those in a minute. In each of the three scenarios, we also mapped the coastal flooding risk that is projected by sea level rise driven by climate change. Once we had our projections of conversion and flooding risk, we quantified the effect of these scenarios. We did that looking at agricultural land type, like cropland, pastureland, and rangeland, as well as on land quality. As with any modeling exercise, there are some caveats. Most importantly, we were not able to account for local zoning. Zoning is inherently local, and there's no national database of local land use regulations. So at the local level, our maps represent the general pattern and rough amount of conversion that is likely based on local conversion patterns from 2001 to 2016. Of course, those patterns reflected the zoning regulations in place during that time period. Our modeling also does not include the impact of water scarcity and potential fallowing of land because of water scarcity or salinization. Mapping the impact of water scarcity involves a complex interplay of many variables and was beyond the scope of our analysis. You'll see in the web app, though, that we did include a data overlay from World Resource Institute's Aqueduct, which gives some details about water scarcity and risk. So here are the three scenarios we modeled. So first, business as usual, as I mentioned. Again, that is a straight line projection based on historical conversion rates out to 2040. The second scenario is what we call runaway sprawl. This envisions a scenario where sprawl gets worse, driven by high housing costs in urban areas and more remote work opportunities, which will only be improved as rural broadband expands. In some parts of the country, we may already be on this trajectory. Lastly, we modeled the future we hope for, better built cities. This scenario envisions successful efforts to minimize the impact of residential, commercial, and industrial development on productive agricultural land. We recognize the need for some development, especially affordable housing, which is why this scenario still results in the conversion of some agricultural land. A quick look at the assumptions that went into the three scenarios. For business as usual, again, we followed the historical rate for both urban and highly developed and low density residential conversion. We only adjusted the conversion rate, the urban and highly developed conversion rate, for population growth. We did that because we know that population growth has a strong correlation with urban and highly developed conversion. It does not have a strong correlation with low density residential development. For runaway sprawl, UHD remains the same as in business as usual, but we projected a 50% increase in low density residential conversion. And in the Better Built City scenario, we modeled a 25% reduction in the urban and highly developed conversion rate and a 50% reduction in low density residential conversion. Research has shown that it's possible to reduce the amount of land use for urban and highly developed development by 25%. We went with a more aggressive 50% reduction in LDR because there is not the same population density as in urban areas. We felt this would be an ambitious but achievable goal. So this next chart shows each scenario's potential impact. The gray bars show that from 2001 to 2016, we converted 11 million acres of agricultural land in this century alone nationwide. Under business as usual or worse, runaway sprawl, we may see another 18 or even 24 million acres of farm and ranch land converted or threatened by conversion. Conversely, if we make smart choices about where and how we site future development, we can reduce the impact to 11 million acres. So you might be thinking 11 million acres is still a lot. Is that really the best case scenario? AFT appreciates that development is necessary and the need for affordable housing options and renewable energy is acute. While it may be possible for cities and towns to be even more compact in their growth, we chose what we believed was a realistic scenario. These next two slides we hope are helpful in showing how Washington compares to other states. This slide shows projected total acres converted by county. The darker the red or really rust, the more acres will be converted. So that's why you see that particularly deep colors in Southern California, Arizona, and Texas. This next slide compares the percent of agricultural land in each county that is projected to be developed. You see a different pattern here, with more of the eastern half of the country turning red because there's a lot of conversion in these smaller counties with smaller amount of agricultural land. Another key finding relates to the impacts on our very best agricultural land. For previous reports, AFT created the first ever index of agricultural land quality that looked at the productivity, versatility, and resiliency of land, or PVR. Land over a certain PVR threshold is considered what we consider nationally significant land, land which is best suited for long-term cultivation and food production. While this land is concentrated in certain parts of the country, every state has some nationally significant land, and Washington has a considerable amount of it. What we find in our future projections is that conversion of this land is likely to be higher than conversion of all agricultural land. Most likely because this land is flat, well-drained, relatively free of rocks. All the reasons for why it is good agricultural land, it's good land for development. The loss of this land is especially concerning. This is land that can produce the highest yields of crops and livestock with the least environmental impacts. Our modeling shows that nearly half of the projected conversion from 2016 to 2040 will occur on nationally significant land even though only 38% of the country's farmland and rangeland qualifies for this category. The more nationally significant land converted, the more reliant we become on marginal land for food production. To put this potential loss of 9 million acres of nationally significant land in perspective, the total acreage of land in the U.S. devoted to fruit, nut, and vegetable production is just 10.4 million acres. So I'm going to do one last slide and turn it back to Addie. This next one relates to coastal flooding due to sea level rise. We mapped what coastal flooding might look like in 2040 based on a projection of 7.5 inches of additional sea level rise. We found that 450,000 acres of farmland and rangeland could be flooded by 2040, including 39,300 acres in Washington alone. Importantly, this number does not include salinization of soils and groundwater, which will jeopardize many more acres even before land is inundated. And additionally, we found that nearly 500,000 acres of existing UHD and LDR land will be flooded nationally, causing residents in those areas to seek more stable housing. The result from that, another 2.7 million acres of agricultural land nationally could be converted to development. And with that, let me turn it back over to Addie to talk through this next finding.
Thanks, Chris. So one of the other threats that we're highlighting with this report is the threat that solar development poses to agricultural land. And first off, to be clear, American Farmland Trust is pro-renewable energy development. However, we think it's essential that we plan carefully so that our most productive, versatile, and resilient land is not compromised as part of this important development that needs to happen in order to make a transition to clean energy. We also think that it's possible for agriculture and solar to coexist in mutually beneficial ways. So that all said, Washington State, as many of you may know, recently passed the Clean Energy Transformation Act, setting a goal to achieve 100% clean energy by 2045. And correspondingly, we've seen a proliferation of solar projects in the last few years. What this map is showing is data from the US Department of Energy's Solar Future Study, which anticipates that about 80,000 acres of currently undeveloped land in Washington will be converted to utility scale solar by 2040. The Department of Energy also predicts that the majority of that utility scale solar will be sited in rural communities. AFT estimates that at least 80% of that acreage will be on agricultural land. But that's just an estimate. So clearly, this is an important conversation for us to be having in Washington, and we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to the end of this presentation and we get to our recommendations and next steps. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Addie. So now we're going to dive into the data available for Washington on the web app that was created to go along with this report. And we will be ably assisted in our cruise through the website by my colleague and website navigator, Beth Fraser. So thank you, Beth. When you start, you will be met with this handy overview. This talks about what we did, what we found, a little bit about what you can do, and helpful information, including some of the links to the reports. To get out of there, you just click on the little X. If you want that back again, you go up to the right-hand corner and click on that About, and that'll take you right back there. Next, let's look at that upper right-hand corner for a minute. Next to the About, you see a How-To tab. This tab takes you to a 5-minute video that explains how to use the various data layers in the scenarios. Next to that, you see View Report tab takes you to our Farmland Information Center website, where you can find the full report and the executive summaries, you also can find the past Farms Under Threat reports, both the State of the States that came out in 2020 and the first one that looked at national findings that was from 2018. We are also making our geospatial data layers available to the public. If you would like them, back up there in the right-hand corner, the Request Data tab is the place, and Beth is showing it now, where you can learn more and make that request. So now Beth is going to take us to Washington. So to get there, all you do is click on the state. When you click on it, it will automatically give you on the left state level information, as well as information on whatever county your cursor happens to be on, in this case, King County. So let's talk a little bit about what this is showing us right here and the information that is available on this page. As you can see here, this gives you for Washington as a whole on the left and King County on the right. The dark red, which is the projected urban and highly developed conversion, modeled under the three different scenarios: business as usual, runaway sprawl, better built cities. The lighter color or orange color on the right is the projected conversion to low density residential development. And as you see in Washington and a little bit in King County, it is more low density residential development that is likely to be the larger driver of conversion than urban and highly developed conversion. So going down, scrolling down, you can see additional information that is helpful. So here we see not just how much acres that could be converted, but acres of what we consider to be Washington's best agricultural land. And when you look at that, you see as a state as a whole that business as usual, it's over 100,000 acres of land that could be converted or threatened by conversion. Runaway sprawl, it's 140,000 acres. And the contrast of what could be saved from that would be, it is 68,000 acres. If, again, we can focus on building more compactly and avoiding the most productive agricultural land. So looking at the type of land that is projected for conversion, you see here that cropland and pasture land are more or less about the same amount, a little bit more with pasture land that is projected to be converted, ranged land a little bit less. And I would just note that this woodland figure is woods associated with farms. So it is not forest land. It is those we mapped in the State of the States, land that was associated, woodland that was associated with farms, and that is the type of woodland that we're talking about here. Importantly, just looking at this last statistic right down here, while low density residential does not always mean the actual conversion of agricultural land. As I said at the beginning, people do farm land in smaller parcels and particularly near urban areas. Once land is developed into low density residential housing, it is 48 times more likely, at least in Washington state, to be converted to urban and highly developed land by 2040 compared to other agricultural land in the state. So let's go back up. One thing that we hope you all will find useful is the downloadable report for Washington. And this again has both a map and it has some of the summary findings. Again, this 192,000 acres that are projected to be converted or threatened by conversion out to 2040. On the right, we took that acreage figure and using data from the 2017 2017 Census of Agriculture. We derived what this looks like in impact. The potential loss of 3,000 farms or ranches, the loss of 178 million in farm output, and the loss of 7,500 jobs associated with farms and ranches. You see here, and we're going to talk a little bit more when Addie takes us on a cruise of the maps, that some of the hardest hit counties in the state are Spokane, Pierce, and Snohomish. As you go down here, again, this gives you more details about the acres of projected conversion. When you see that runaway sprawl has an even higher number of the possibility of 238,000 acres being threatened by conversion. And you see that we talk about how development choices matter, and that in fact, if we are able to move in a direction toward better built cities and more compact development, that in fact we could reduce significantly the loss of farms and jobs and farm output. So with that, let me turn it to you, Addie, to talk a little bit more about the maps.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to Beth for helping out here. So yeah, Beth, can you go ahead and just zoom in here a little bit on Snohomish County, since Chris shared that that's one of the counties that's projected to be hardest hit here. And let's choose on the left-hand side, let's do the business as usual. Let's do runaway sprawl here. Yep, and then on the other side, let's do the better built cities, just so that we can compare and contrast. So what you're seeing here on the left-hand side, all of those areas that are lighting up as orange under this runaway sprawl scenario are really the worst case scenario for what could happen in this kind of unchecked growth. And you can see the contrast with what it looks like if we make some different choices. The one thing that stays consistent here in the blue area is the areas of projected sea level rise. On what Chris mentioned earlier, we are expecting close to 40,000 acres of agricultural land to be compromised by sea level rise. And that will be true regardless of the growth choices that we make, but certainly there's something that we need our communities to be planning for. Can you zoom out just a click or two so we can get a little bit bigger picture of the region? Thank you. So maybe back in one or two more. Thank you. What I think is powerful about the data when we look at Puget Sound in particular, it's no coincidence that Snohomish and Pierce counties are hardest hit here, where they're the two counties on the closest edge of King County. And with the rapid growth that we're seeing in Seattle, King County already has an incredibly strong farmland protection program. And so we're projecting that we'll see more growth and more sprawl in the adjoining counties. But the other takeaway here, when you look at the map on the left-hand side, you see orange lighting up on the Olympic Peninsula. You see it light up in the islands. And so this isn't just an urban issue or an issue that's a problem for large metropolitan areas. It's going to be an issue that we're seeing on the outskirts of small cities all over the state. So let's go ahead with that and just pop across the state all the way over to Spokane, which is one of the other counties that lit up pretty hard. And we can go ahead and zoom in over there. So again, we can see the contrast here between the runaway sprawl and the better built cities scenario. Just the difference in the projected conversion in this metro area. And the other thing that I think is powerful about looking at Spokane is we really see how this is an issue that crosses state lines. And there are some significant differences in the state land use planning programs between Washington and Idaho. And we can see with more growth in the Spokane metro area, it's really going to start spilling over into Idaho. So this is something that crosses geopolitical boundaries, and we need communities to be working together on. The last thing that I wanted to show you all, Beth, if you can go ahead and zoom out so we can see the full state. Chris mentioned earlier that we were not able to factor in water scarcity in our projections of development. And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's very complicated to try to predict how water scarcity will intersect with the many different choices that people make. But what we have offered with this tool is the option to toggle on this water scarcity layer, which you see in the bottom left corner. So when you check that box, it'll turn on the water scarcity layer. You can see the areas where Washington is predicted to experience moderate to severe water scarcity in the next 20 years. And then you can dial in and look at how that might intersect with development choices in a particular area. And I think this is mostly really informative as we're thinking about making the case for smarter development. We can look at how a particular community might be predicted to be affected by water scarcity and how that might inform the land use planning choices that we want to make. So really, this is a tool for you with lots of different options to explore, and I hope that you find it useful. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Chris.
Great, thank you so much, Addie. That was a terrific tour. We're going to stop for a couple of questions. And here is one question, which is, what information do you have that about lands that fall under conservation easements? So very glad that this question was asked. AFT has developed the first ever, there are a number of national databases around national conservation easements. AFT took that information and additional information to create a protected agricultural land database, or what we call PALD, P-A-L-D. We will be releasing that data layer. I believe it might actually be already available for download. And again, if you want to find that data layer and you want that information, please, again, in that upper right corner of the web app, you see a request data tab. And you can request that data for Washington State there. I think that's a good question, and I would look to Addie in terms of what we know about how many acres of land in Washington are already protected that are considered agricultural. And I don't know if you have that number off of the top of your head, Addie.
It's a great question, and I know that we have pulled that number before. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I will be happy to dig it up and follow up.
Right, and I should say that number one, please feel free to keep putting questions in, and again, to do that, you go to questions in the control panel on the right-hand side, click on that little box, it'll pop it out, and you can write in a question. That we will respond to all questions, and happy to send out responses to everybody when we send out the link to the webinar recording. So let's look at a couple of other questions. How much detail is there on how you define a better built city? I will take a stab at that. Addie, feel free to add. The better built, the way we did these scenarios was simply to assume a percentage reduction in certain kinds of conversion. So we did not make particular assumptions about what goes into a better built city. I think we have an instinctive feel for what a better built city is. From my perspective, it is one that is pedestrian friendly, one that provides affordable housing for all, one that is walkable, and that there are public transportation options. Addie, feel free to jump in here, but I think that, again, from our perspective, that we see that better built cities are ones that sort of embody the principles of smart growth. Would you like to add to that, Addie?
I think you did a great job describing that, Chris. And I think another feature that I might offer is this idea, sort of a hard edge, where when you leave the city, and you're in open space or rural communities, as opposed to leaving the city and you don't know where the city ends and the next city starts. That the idea that growth and sprawl is really contained, and there is abundant rural or agricultural or wild lands on the urban edge.
Great. So here's a question, Addie, that you may be able to answer. It relates to water scarcity. It's why in Thurston and Lewis County are there small spots of color signaling a small amount of water scarcity? Any sense of that?
I'd have to spend a little bit more time drilling down into the data. I don't have a great answer right offhand for that.
Right.
I did want to say I did a quick poll and to the previous question about protected acreage in Washington. This data is a couple years old, but the last time we did an analysis at AFT, it was about 68,000 acres in Washington that were permanently protected by easement.
Great, thank you. Here's another question that I don't know we will be able to answer. It relates to water scarcity. It says, can you talk more about the box you can check? When someone checked it, it's all yellow except for projected development. What does that mean? I frankly don't know. When I was cruising around it earlier, it did have different gradations of color. We have had times in the web app, again, this is relatively new, all of the kinks are not entirely out of the system, so it might take a while for that data layer to load and show different colors. I don't know if that is the challenge or if there's some other reason behind that. We can certainly check on that for you and be back in touch when we are sending out answers to questions. So let me ask, here's a question. Addie, you're welcome to take the first swing at it, and then I can as well. What kinds of land use regulations prevent low density residential land from becoming urban and highly developed? And I guess that I would actually add to that to say, since we know that LDR land, once it is in the LDR, it is very likely to be UHD, that the second part of that question should be what kind of land use regulations prevent land from becoming LDR in the first place? Do you want to take a first stab at that, Addie?
Absolutely, and I'm gonna stick with the first part of the question because I think it's a just to start off, I think it's an interesting one when we think about land that's in LDR. So rural land, possibly on the urban fringe, possibly already been subdivided into smaller lots. You've got houses that are cropping up. Maybe they're 5-acre, maybe they're 10-acre lots. I think it's really worth naming that, particularly when we think about the next generation of farmers, people who are looking to get started in agriculture, small acreage lots may be exactly what they are looking for in order to get started. It might be what they can afford, and it might be what they're looking to farm. And so one of the things that we can do in thinking about preventing the further conversion of LDR land is, how do we help agriculture stay viable in these LDR areas? What infrastructure can we provide in terms of access to markets? What incentives can we provide to farming businesses like seed companies or fertilizer retailers to stay in the area? And how do we help that land to stay affordable and accessible to beginning farmers, where land values in Washington, as everyone knows, are only going up? So how do we help that land to stay within reach so that it really is accessible by farmers and not just by folks who either are going to keep a hobby farm or a large estate or just further develop it? So those are some of my thoughts around preventing that otherwise pretty inevitable slide from LDR into UHD. And Chris, maybe I'll let you talk about the piece about how do we prevent LDR.
Great. That was a great answer on the LDR front and how important that is on those opportunities on those smaller acre parcels. So in thinking about both regulations and planning to prevent LDR in the first place, Addie talked at the beginning about the importance of those sort of hard edges and really trying to be thoughtful from a planning perspective of those urban growth boundaries and trying not to continue that sort of slow march outward and instead to look inward in city boundaries. And that is true both in major cities and in smaller communities as well. Again, thinking about what are the ways, and we will talk about this in a minute. In fact, that might be a very good segue to get us there, about the need for looking at infill development. And again, these are things that are not just big city issues, but small town issues. And federally and statewide, what are those kind of incentives that you can have for developers and development to be going up and not out and filling in and not out? And so I guess with that, and I would say the importance of comprehensive plans, and I know that that's one of the things we're going to talk about in a minute. So let's actually, that was the last question I was seeing. So let's in fact turn now back to the PowerPoint and talk a little bit more about action and what can each of us do to help choose an abundant future. So if you are a county commissioner or a state legislator or a congressional staffer, our report has policy recommendations in each of these 4 categories that we that are tailored for your particular level of government. We hope that you will find a recommendation that you can champion, and we encourage you to do that. Please let us know if we can provide you with any additional information about any of the recommendations in the report. If you are a farmer, a rancher, or a community advocate, we encourage you to share and discuss these policy recommendations with your elected representatives. And let me highlight just a few examples of what you can do. So promoting smart growth. We tend to think of smart growth and compact development as simply city issues, but rural communities can play important roles as well. For instance, zoning ordinances that allow accessory housing units in residentially zoned areas. So think mother-in-law apartments or apartments located in a barn or other farm buildings can help to expand affordable housing options within existing infrastructure. And these types of accessory housing units and these types of zoning can be very effective at the community and rural community level. Protecting agricultural land. Congress will be writing a new farm bill next year. An important program in that bill is the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, which helps to fund the purchase of development rights from willing farmers and ranchers. More funding for that program would help to protect more farm and ranch land in Washington. Advanced solar, smart solar siting. Local governments can ensure that best practices are followed when siting solar on farmland. So this includes best practices for the construction, operation, and decommissioning to preserve soil health, water resources, and the ability for a farmer or rancher to farm the land during and after the life of the project. And supporting farmland access. One important thing a state can do is invest in farm linking. And by that, I mean not just a website where landowners can post properties for sale or lease for farm seekers, but a robust program that provides individualized technical assistance to both retiring producers and absentee landowners, as well as farm seekers, to help identify potential successors or land access opportunities. With that, let me turn it back to Addie.
Thanks, Chris. So before we wrap up, I want to talk about some of the ways that communities in Washington can work toward these key for policy recommendations by proactively planning for agriculture. And planning for ag is critically important to the smart growth that our report recommends. This involves these 4 basic principles that can work in tandem with efforts to plan for smarter, more compact development. So first of all, inventorying agricultural resources in the community, as that includes land base as well as infrastructure to support agriculture, engaging farmers and ranchers in that process at all levels and stages of ag, incorporating agriculture into community plans, and then implementing tools to retain and protect that land. We are entering a critical window of opportunity in Washington as counties and many of the cities within them will have comprehensive plan updates due beginning in late 2024. So there's never been a better time to be having these conversations. There are many resources on planning for agriculture that can be found on our Farmland Information Center website, and we'll hope that you check those out. One additional tool that we've been working on within my team is overlaying farms under threat data with zoning maps for select counties so that we can better understand how local zoning poses a threat to our best agricultural land. So if that's of interest to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll be sharing some of those findings at an upcoming event in August hosted by the Washington Food Policy Forum. And the last thing that I want to mention is just to really put in a plug specifically about urban density and housing. You know, Bill, as we've already talked about, building more dense urban areas is a key way that we limit urban sprawl and protect our best farmland. But too often, urban density is seen as just that, an urban issue. And I really want to encourage rural communities, farmers, and agricultural advocates to consider coming to the table to support more housing and more dense housing in our state, because that's going to be a key way that we work together to protect our best farmland, especially in our peri-urban environments. With that, I'll pass it back to Chris.
Great. So there's 2 questions here, Addie, I think both to you. One was somebody asking, say again what that August event is.
Absolutely. So the Washington State Food Policy Forum will be hosting a listening session about land use and threats to farmland, and it'll be open to anyone who's interested, and we can circulate the information for that as part of our follow-up to this webinar.
Great. And the second question says, in Washington, the Growth Management Act was passed in 1990. How does it work to help protect farmland?
Great question. And there are hours-long trainings to answer that particular question. So quickly, what the Growth Management Act does is it requires counties and the cities within them that meet a certain growth threshold to plan and to plan for a number of key things, one of which is agriculture. And then counties and cities are required to update those plans on a regular basis. So it aligns local planning with state level goals for how we collectively care for our landscape, while still giving a lot of control to individual counties and cities about how they work toward those goals. So there's lots more that we can dig into there, and I'm again happy to point folks in the direction of more learning on that subject because it's a really meaty one.
Great, thank you. So we hope this information has been helpful. We hope it will spur you to take action, whether that's at the community level, state level, federal level. And we are here to help. And what I want to do in these last couple of minutes is point out some resources that are available through American Farmland Trust. First and foremost, Addie and her team are a fabulous resource, and being in touch with Addie for any follow-up questions is an absolutely great way to get questions answered. Two other resources that are national in scope. The first is the Farmland Information Center. So this is a national clearinghouse for information about agricultural land that is a partnership between American Farmland Trust and USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. The FIC, as we call it, is a treasure trove of information. It has state policy information, laws. It has statistics about the census, about age and demographics of farmers and farmland owners. It has information for landowners that are interested in protecting land. It has a wealth of resources, both for service providers and for farmers, ranchers, landowners about conservation practices and soil health. Most importantly, as you might have seen in that last slide, there was a Ask an Expert. You can ask any question that you want of the Farmland Information Center, and you can do that either by email or via phone. And in fact, they do answer the phone. So please consider the Farmland Information Center a resource. Secondly is the National Agricultural Land Network, and that is a network that AFT established in 2020 after the Farms Under Threat State of the State report, as a way to connect and provide learning and peer networking opportunities for those of us who think about this work to save farm and ranch land. It is a national network. It is free. It is still growing. We hope that you will join us, and there is a link to more information about it in the chat, as well as information for the Farmland Information Center. We really encourage you to join the network, and we encourage you to let us know what information you need. And in fact, we will be following up with a survey asking that kind of question of what kind of information could you use in helping to do your work at the community and state level. So with that, Addie, back to you to close us out.
Thank you, Chris. So I want to thank everyone again for being here today and for your interest in preserving and protecting agriculture in our state. All of us on this call come from this work from very diverse and sometimes divergent places and vantage points, but I think what ties us together is our shared investment in this landscape and our shared desire for healthy ecosystems and healthy communities. And today we focused mostly on the threats to Washington's agricultural land, but I want to acknowledge that there are just as many, if not more, threats to the viability of farm businesses in our state. And as Chris mentioned earlier, it's not farmland without farmers. We have many challenges and tough decisions ahead of us, But I'm personally optimistic that our common ground is a really powerful asset that can serve us well as we plan for the future. So I really hope that you continue to look to AFT as a resource and partner in your work. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you all. We appreciate you joining us this morning. Have a great rest of your day.